Hey guys, welcome to the wood shop. Today we are working on a bookshelf, and I came across kind of a jig that we've done in the past, but I found that it's a really great way of cutting dados in especially longer pieces. Obviously a dado set's a great way to cut dados on your table saw, but sometimes when you're working with a taller piece, like this bookcase side we're working on, it becomes a little cumbersome when you're trying to push this across your dado set on your table saw. So the jig I want to show you guys today, we have done the magazine before, and we'll probably include some links on the drawings and kind of the how-to of that, but I want to do a quick video of how we do this jig and kind of demonstrate how easy it is. So without further ado, what I've got is I've got my bookcase side laid out. I've got 3 dados in this bookcase side. One of them's a stop dado, and then I've got 2 through dados, okay? So how I like to do this is I'm using just some scrap plywood. I prefer to use plywood because it tends to stay straight. Any hardwood would work fine too. I would avoid softwoods, only because what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna actually be using a bearing guided bit. And if you're doing multiples of these, that bearing can start to kind of eat into your material a little bit, indent it, and it will change the dynamic of the joint. So something hard, a multi-ply plywood or a hardwood would be fine. So what I've done is I've cut 2 rails that are about 4 inches wider than my panel. And this stock's 2.5, 3 inches wide. That doesn't really matter that much, okay? And then I've cut 2 end pieces and I'm going to capture these rails over this panel. First thing I'm going to do, and you can do this anywhere you want to along the panel, you do need a trusty square. Whether it's a combination square like this or you've got a framing square that's right on the money, then whatever you use that you trust, this is key, okay? This keeps that dado square to your panel. So what I'm doing is I'm bringing my first rail over, I'm lining it up with my square. I've got that lined up. I'm going to clamp this in place. So we know that's in position. I'll grab one of my shorter pieces here, and I'm going to bring this up against the edge of my side here, and I'm gonna make sure that that's tight on there. If you want to and need an extra set of hands, you can always come in here and kind of clamp that in place while you're doing that. And I'm just going to secure this with a couple screws. It's really not necessary to glue this, and quite honestly I think if you're trying to glue this, glue does sometimes want to shift on you, so this might be a good idea to just leave that out. So now that I've got that side in place, I'm going to grab my other kind of stop, make sure it's tight against my workpiece. I'm going to clamp this in place. Make sure when you're driving your screws that they get well below the surface of your rails. You don't want to be catching those with your router when you're going over it later. Whatever material you're using, this surface is where your bearing is going to be riding. So you want to make sure that surface is pretty darn flat, because if it's not, if it's got any undulations in it at all, it's going to show up in your dado, okay? So here's how I set this for the perfect width. I'm using a couple pieces of scrap, and these are cut-offs of some of the material. I always like to save these things from cutting them off from my shelves or whatever. I save those, and I use these as setup blocks. So now I can get the perfect width dado, okay? One thing you need to be careful of. I know my planer is absolutely perfect and never leaves any snipe whatsoever. But you want to make sure that your panels don't have snipe on them, because a lot of times when we're cutting these to final length, we may be cutting these and maybe there's a little snipe on that end. You don't want to use that snipe as your setup, because obviously it's going to leave too tight of a dado and you're not going to be able to get your shelf in place. So make sure maybe you run a piece ahead of your final work pieces so you don't get snipe on your shelves, okay? For safety's sake, as far as just making sure I get these snug on there, I'm just putting a clamp across the joint here. I'm not bearing down on this to where I can't move these. I just want to make sure that that stays in place while I'm screwing this other guide rail in place. I will mention we did do a jig that was actually adjustable, so you could kind of fine tune it. Very similar to this, and it was done in the magazine as well. I just find that this jig is quick and as easy as it is. It works really, really well. Now that we've got our jig built, I want to show you how we use this. It does fit the panel really, really well, but we do need to secure it in place so it doesn't shift on us when we're cutting. So what I like to do is I'll come in with a clamp here, and I'm just going to pinch this, making sure it's tight against your panel and that it's out of the way of your guide rails. Lined up properly, we're just going to kind of clamp this and pinch this in place so that way I know it's not going to move. Okay, so that's secure. I've got my plunge router set up with the bit, and the bit, what we're using is kind of a little pattern bit. You notice how short the cutting surface is here. It's a short bit. It's got a bearing on the bottom. In this case, it's going to be on the top. And I've set my plunge depth so it'll go 3/8 inch deep into this panel. The other thing of note here, this bit is 5/8 inch in diameter. So I'm going to make a pass down, a pass back. Trying to match a 3/4 inch bit, obviously, to your panel material. It's very hard. This is a great way, again, to get an accurate dado. I'm going to do this in a couple different passes too. Grab one of my shelves. We're going to test the fit. Notice how I can just kind of push that down in there. I don't have to pound it in. We've got a nice snug fit, which is just what you want. I do have a stop dado on this panel back here. What I've done with my jig is basically I've positioned a stop block on here, so that gives me basically, when I take my router up, that edge of that bit will stop at that line. So I've got a positive stop. I'm doing the same thing, going down, stopping against that stop, and then coming back, making my cut, plunging it down until I'm 3/8 inch deep.